Don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, and tap like if this kind of story finds you in the dark. The key is smaller than my thumb, its bow shaped like a tear, dull brass rubbed smooth by years of hiding in hems and seams, and later in the hollow of my palm. When I think back to the first time I understood that my family was a house built on locked rooms, I taste metal and dust on my tongue, and I hear the old wall clock at the end of the hallway chew the minutes with its wooden mouth. It ticked in that steady, patient way, like a creature sure it would outlive us all. And the mirror, the mirror stood opposite the clock, an oval with a foxed face and a scar running diagonally across the glass like the thin white line on my right forearm. The mirror gave nothing away. It swallowed faces, offered them back clouded, as if the truth lived just under the silver and could not afford to show itself. I was 8 years old and loved to sit on the floorboards near the mirror in the late afternoons, when the corridor took the light like tea steeping in a glass. The floor smelled of wax and old rain. My mother would call to me from the kitchen, her voice brisk as a broom. "Not there, Liesel. That draft will catch in your bones." But I liked how the wind slipped under the door and made the curtains breathe. I liked to touch the small knot in the baseboard where the wood had kept a secret ring, and to tug at a loose thread at the hem of my dress until the fabric sighed. I thought the mirror and the clock were old friends who talked when we weren't looking. I imagined the clock saying, "It is time," and the mirror answering, "Not yet." There was a door near the clock, painted the same bleak cream as the rest of the hallway, with a keyhole that seemed too large, as if it had been designed for eyes rather than keys. The door had no handle on our side, only a simple iron plate, and the hole, and behind it, so we were told, was the storage cupboard where my father kept the winter blankets and the boxes of broken things that would be mended when there is time. It was the only door in the house with no handle. "Mice," my mother said once, when I asked why it needed a lock. "Blankets invite mice. The door keeps them out." I nodded, because in those years, a mother's word landed like a stamp on paper, leaving a picture that felt more real than the blank sheet underneath. My father had hands that remembered every tool they had ever held. He could turn a key with such gentleness, it made me think of a midwife coaxing a baby's first cry. When he came home in the evenings, his coat cold and his hair smelling of night air, he would stand under the clock and look at it as though they had a private quarrel. "Fast," he'd mutter, "or slow. Which is it?" He never asked the mirror. He tilted his head toward the locked door once and then looked away quickly, like a man glancing at a portrait of someone he owes money to. I learned the word sister from a discarded library book with a cracked spine. The picture showed two girls in matching coats, their breath ghosting in front of their mouths. "Sister," I spelled out, tracing the letters with a careful finger. I liked the shape of it, like two hands holding the same warm bowl. But in our home, sister was like a bird that never visited our trees. There was a space where such a bird might have perched, and the branches never moved. Sometimes, late at night, when the house had folded itself around my parents' sleep, I would creep out to the hallway in my stockinged feet and crouch by the mirror. My face would appear as if surfacing from deep water, hair stuck damply to my cheeks, eyes large and foolish. I would listen. The clock would give me its 1, 2, 3, like a slow heartbeat. The door, if I pressed my ear to it, gave me wood and silence, and only once when I was 9, and the first frost laid lace over the stoop, I heard what could have been a hum. It was a small sound, high and tremulous, and it faded as soon as I remembered to be afraid. I kept that sound in my throat like a pearl I must not swallow. I kept it through the winter when the curtains grew stiff with cold, through the spring when the water in the pipes groaned and coughed, through the summer when my mother boiled the sheets and hung them, wet and smelling of clean heat, on the line. I kept it when my father went on a 3-day trip to fix a machine in a warehouse, 2 towns over, and my mother moved through the rooms with a sharpness that made the air ache. We had rules. Some were the ordinary rules of childhood. Wash hands, say grace. Do not speak when adults are speaking. Keep your shoes by the door. Help carry the firewood. Do not waste. Others were rules that grew like ivy from the corners, their vines almost invisible until you walked into them and felt the green burn. Do not ask about the upstairs room. Do not stand by the hallway after sunset. Do not hum in the house. Humming invites spirits. Do not touch the clock. It is older than you are and will not forgive your fingerprints. Do not look for the key. This last rule was never spoken, and yet I knew it as clearly as I knew how to braid my own hair. When I was 10, I began to collect things that felt like clues. A strand of hair lighter than my mother's, finer than mine, caught in the hinge of the mirror. A button under the hallway rug, pale blue with 2 holes, the kind you sew on a baby's cardie. A scrap of music, just 3 notes, which slipped out of my mouth when I was pouring water into a basin and surprised me, because I had never heard it before, and yet it felt like something had taught it to me. I kept the hair, the button, the tune. I kept them the way you keep the smell of rain on your skin after you run back indoors. The mirror began to show me hints I did not know how to read. I would straighten my collar and see, over my shoulder, a blur of white as if a small figure had passed across the frame and vanished at the edge. I would lift my chin and touch the little mole beneath it, and for a moment the mole would double, like an echo. The clock kept time with a stubborn insistence that made me want to open it and oil its joints to ask it to be kinder. I once stood on a chair and pressed my ear against its wooden case, hearing gears whispering to one another like people behind a door. I am not a mouse, I told it solemnly. You don't need the lock for me. On my 12th birthday, my father gave me a handkerchief with my initials embroidered in the one corner. The handkerchief smelled faintly of camphor. He had kept it with the winter things. My mother baked me a small lemon cake with a skin of sugar so thin it broke like ice under the knife. Later, when the plates were washed and the afternoon was waning, my father took a tin from the pantry shelf and brought it to the hallway. He unfolded a cloth and polished the oval mirror slow circles, tender as if it were an old wound. Then he opened the small panel in the side of the clock and wound it, careful not to overwind. I watched his hands, because his hands, like the clock, knew how to carry on. He set the tin back on the shelf and stood very still, his back to us, and my mother cleared her throat and said, too brightly, "Liesel, fetch your scarf. The air is turning." When I bent to lift my scarf from the peg, I saw it. The key, tiny as a winter seed, resting on the skirting board behind the clock, as if the clock had coughed it up after a long swallow. I made no sound. I walked to the kitchen with the scarf in my hand, and I wrapped it around my neck, though the room was warm with steam from the kettle. Only later, when the house was sleeping and the moon was a smudge on the blind, did I slide out of bed, feel my way along the cool wall to the hallway, and sink down so that my cheek nearly touched the floor. The key lay where it had lain, sideways, the bow looking at me like an eye that knew my name. The mirror watched. The clock approved or did not. I could not tell. I held my breath, reached under the case, pinched the key between my fingers, and it was as if I had taken a live thing. Heat bled into my skin. I waited for footsteps, for my mother's hand on my shoulder, for the house to scold. But there was only the hush that comes when a rule shifts its weight in the dark. I did not open the door that night. I took the key to my room and slid it into the hem of my slip, where a seam had come loose. It lay there, taking my warmth, such a simple object, but it entered my dreams like rain enters thirsty soil. I dreamed of a room full of white cloth, of a window that showed only sky, of a small pair of shoes lined up next to my own. In the morning, I woke to sunlight on the floor, and to the smell of coffee my mother had ground already, and to the certainty that the door would now have a heartbeat if I leaned against it. The first time I used the key, the day had the kind of heat that makes knives stick slightly to bread. My mother had gone to fetch more soap, and my father was mending a neighbor's chair in the yard. I wiped my hands on my skirt, the way I had watched my mother do when she was about to do something difficult, and I went to the hallway. The clock saw me. The mirror had a bruise of shadow along its edge. I knelt, because kneeling felt necessary, and I placed the key in the mouth of the door as gently as I might feed a crumb to a shy bird. It fit. The first turn was stiff. The second turn felt like a sigh leaving a chest after a long hold. I pressed, and the door opened an inch 2-3, the gap revealing not mice and blankets, but a sliver of pale air and a smell like boiled milk. I did not look back. I squeezed inside and closed the door behind me almost all the way, leaving it notched, because I had the sense that if it latched fully, it might forget me. The space was small, but it was not a cupboard. There was a narrow bed with white sheets tucked so tightly I could have bounced a coin on them, a small table with a book on it, and a window with the blind drawn down halfway so the light made a soft puddle on the floor. The sound I had dreamed I had heard years ago, the hum was here. It came from a shy corner of the room, where a little music box sat with its lid open, but its key unwound. The tune was not playing. The hum came from me, maybe, or from the way the light talked to the dust. There were drawings pinned to the wall, which would one day make my throat ache to remember. Pencil trees with branches like hands. A cat, a face undone and redone until it was more eraser than lead. And there were shoes beside the bed, small, scuffed, as if they had practiced dancing and stopped mid-step. On the table was the book with a ribbon between its pages, a fairy tale about a girl who could turn herself into a bird, but always found her way home, because she had stitched a bell into one wing. I touched nothing at first. I stood, and I let the room find me. When the door whispered behind me, my heart tripped and fell. But it was only air. I moved to the bed and pressed my hand to the corner of the sheet, which was creased in a way that suggested someone had been sitting there not long before. On the pillow lay a strand of hair, lighter than mine. I picked it up and stretched it between my fingers, fine as spider silk, and for a moment everything in me paused, like a plan held in a mouth. I placed the hair in my pocket, not knowing that I was repeating a motion I had already performed years earlier, and I lifted the edge of the bedspread to peek beneath. There were boxes there, small and orderly, tied with thin cord. They were labeled in a white, careful hand: January, February, March. The cords did not knot the same way my mother knotted them. I slid one box closer. My fingers shook, clumsy, but the lid came away without sound. Inside were folded notes. They were written on thin paper, the ink faded at the edges, each signed with the same initial, E. I read the first, then the second, then the fourth, then stopped breathing where I stood. Liesel, the first one, said, though I was sure it could not possibly be addressed to me, Liesel, my little winter star, I will see you when the hands of the clock point both to heaven. Be patient and be brave. The third, I counted 27 breaths after the door closed, and I could no longer hear your feet, and then I counted 27 more. Did you leave a ribbon for me? If you did, I cannot find it. And the last, I am here, even when I am not. I am here, even when I am not. Do not let them rub me out. Your body becomes a bell at moments like that. The words ring and ring. Your bones learn a sound you cannot unlearn. I replaced the notes, my hands clumsy with a new kind of knowing, and I became aware of the floor's faint tremor. My father crossing the yard, the chair speaking under his hammer. I closed the box. I backed toward the door. I took the key from where I had set it on the table, and I slipped out into the smell of boiled cabbage and wood polish, leaving the room exactly as the room had taught me to leave it, without footprints, without a breath out of place. Afterwards, the house looked the same and did not, the way a face looks after someone has told it a true thing. The mirror was still a patient oval with a flaw like a scar. The clock still bit down on the minutes, but the wall felt thinner to my hand. The air knew my name differently. I went to bed that night with the key in my hem, the strand of hair under my pillow, and a new rule written inside my ribs. Do not make a sound when your life is splitting open. I went back the next day, and the next, and then not for a week, because my mother fell ill and needed someone to measure the drops and fold the napkins and close the curtains just so. When I did return, a small glass of milk stood on the table in the room, a biscuit on a plate beside it. The milk had a skin. The biscuit had been nibbled. I checked the boxes. A new note lay atop the others. It said only the clock, the mirror, the key. I turned and realized that on the opposite wall of the small room there hung a cheap tin clock, stopped at 12. Under it, a small oval mirror, also flawed. The mirror showed me thinner, my eyes bruised with new knowledge. When I leaned closer, the air between my skin and the glass felt warmer, as if it had been breathed on. I began to leave small things. A sprig of mint from the garden, a ribbon from my braid. Once, a square of lemon cake wrapped in cloth, which went missing so quickly I wondered if the air itself had teeth. In return, I sometimes found a drawing, or a button in an unfamiliar color, or a note written in the same tireless, careful hand. The notes did not explain. They never used names. They spoke in coded softness. This morning the sparrows counted to 8, one said. When will you? The bell in my chest is too loud. Another. If you see the woman with the red scarf, do not let her inside. She is more shadow than woman. She will drain the milk. And another, after a bitterly quiet Tuesday when my father burned a stack of papers in the yard and my mother stood watching with her hands inside her sleeves. When the clock clicks its tongue twice between hours, listen. That is me. I listened. Between the hours, between 2 and 3, between 5 and 6, there was a sound, a soft scolding tick that did not belong. It came from the space where the door's lock sat, and it made me imagine a small mouth trying to learn to speak with iron in its teeth. On those days, I smiled at the mirror and told it, in a whisper, that I understood. The mirror kept my words as if it were a bank for misfit truths. The day I first heard her voice, the sky had the color of a bruise healing. I had just set a clean handkerchief on the little table white, embroidered with the clumsiest E I could manage when the air shifted. It was not a draft. It was the way a room inhales before a second person enters it. Don't turn, a voice said very quietly. Not yet. I had not meant to turn, but hearing the instruction made the urge climb my throat. My hands found each other at my waist and held on. I won't, I said. The words came out small. The clock in the hallway, the real clock, gave a single cluck, and the little stopped clock in the hidden room seemed to remember how to swallow. You smell like lemon, she said, and the relief that flooded me was so large it made me want to sit. I did not sit. I stayed standing because standing made me feel like I had bones. "And wool," she said after a moment, "and the cold in your hair." "I didn't want to scare you," I said, which was only partly true. I had not wanted to be scared myself. The air behind me moved, the tremble of a hand adjusting a cuff. "I asked the mirror," she said, "but it only told me that there are 2 of us today." The next second stretched like warm toffee. In it I realized that to turn would be to change everything, and that not to turn would also be to change everything, and so the only choice left to me was which change to dare first. The room watched. The dust was holy. The notes in their box hummed with written breath. I turned. She was smaller than I expected. 13, maybe. 14. Her hair fell to her shoulders in a straight, reluctant sheet, the color of straw in winter. Her mouth had the shape of someone still learning which words are allowed and which must be kept under the tongue. Her eyes were mine, if mine had learned to be quiet longer. She wore a dress the color of the pale blue button I had found years ago and kept, without knowing I was saving it for this moment. Her hands were folded, and one thumb worried a scar on the other wrist, as if it were a worry bead. She smiled, but the smile landed behind her eyes, as if traveling the long road from a place where smiles go to be watered. "I know you," she said. "I have known you forever." "I don't know you at all," I said. And then, because it came to me, the way a bell rings, "But I do. I have a strand of your hair. It has been teaching me." She laughed, and her laugh was a sound I recognized from my own mouth when I was trying not to let joy be too loud. "I felt that," she said, "when you lifted it." I felt as if someone had opened a window in my chest. She lifted a hand as if to touch my sleeve, and then thought better of it. "You're late," she said gently, "but I forgive you. I know it is not your fault." "What am I late for?" "For being my sister," she said, as if she were saying, "for coming to tea, for letting me be yours." The word entered the room and made new corners. Sister. It hung in the air like a lantern. I stepped once, not quite a step, a leaning toward her. "Is that my name on the notes?" I asked. "I found them. I shouldn't have, but I did." She nodded, and something in her face loosened, as if a string had been untied. "They said I was not to write your name. They said it would make me greedy, but I am greedy. I wanted to wrap my mouth around it, so I cut it to a single letter, and I hoped the mirror would remember the rest." "What is your name?" I asked, though part of me already felt the answer, warming my tongue. The clock in the hallway sighed, as if tired of keeping secrets on our behalf. "Etta," she said, and the name made the little stop clock twitch, an old muscle under its thin skin. Etta with 2 Ds, like the sound of a knocking that no one answers. My mouth formed the shape. Etta. It fit. It hurt. It was sweet. I smiled for real, not the polite smile children are given to practice with, and I said, "We are late for many things, I think." We learned one another's faces before we dared more. We stood not far apart, each taking turns to look and look away. She had the same crooked tooth I hid behind my bottom lip when I was shy. I had the same small scar near my temple that she had the habit of touching when she was thinking. We were 2 halves of a photograph someone had torn and put in different boxes. Only later did we talk. When we did, we spoke in the gentle code of the notes at first, as if grown-ups might be listening through the keyhole we had both learned to be afraid of. "Do they know you know?" she asked, and I shook my head, and she nodded with relief, so fierce it startled me. "Good. If they ask, you must show them your palms and say nothing is written there." "Why is there a room?" I asked. "Why a door with no handle on our side?" It felt like asking why water sometimes carries a dead leaf with such tenderness you forget to be sad. She looked at the little mirror under the stop clock, then at my face in front of her, as if measuring how much truth we could survive. Because, she said, they were not strong enough to bury me and not brave enough to claim me. So they stacked the blankets on a story and called it storage. The words stood in the air for a moment, trembling, and then they began to knit themselves into sense. I am the blanket, she added, half smiling. I am the box of broken things. If you are still with me, take a breath and quietly subscribe. Leave a thought in the comments and press like. It helps me carry this weight a little further. Edda taught me how to listen for footsteps and to count the creaks between boards, the way other girls count the stitches in a scarf. She showed me the place where the skirting board loosened if you pressed your knee against it, and where, if you slid a note into the gap, it would drop into the space behind the wall that the mice used as a highway. The mice bring me news, she said. They tell me when the woman with the red scarf is in the kitchen, and when your father forgets to wash the paint from his hands, and when the weather is going to sulk. Who is the woman with the red scarf? I asked, thinking of one of my mother's church friends, a stern woman with a mouth like a tight purse. She comes at noon on Thursdays, Edda said. She says she is from the parish. She smells like vinegar and old roses. She uses my name as if it were a punishment. Edda, sit. Edda, eat. Edda, be grateful. She thinks grateful means quiet. But grateful is a wide word. It has room for bells. Does she know? I faltered. The word sister felt too tender to hand to that imagined woman. Does she know about me? She knows about the mirror, Edda said, and her face flickered. She knows about the clock. She says time heals, and then she looks at the clock as if it were supposed to applaud. We made a habit of each other. I would wait for my mother to hum in the kitchen, the safe old tune that meant her hands were busy and her mind was elsewhere, and then I would vanish into the thin space behind the false cupboard. Edda would be waiting, sometimes with her hair braided, sometimes with it loose like night water. Often she had drawn something new. Once she showed me a pencil portrait of our mother, the mouth softened, the eyes almost kind. This is how she looks right before she sleeps, she said. For a moment, the dark takes her hands and holds them, and she forgets to clench. You see her? I asked, surprised into bluntness. She comes sometimes, Edda said simply. Very late. She sits on the edge of the bed and does not touch me. She tells me the weather, as if the weather were a story we could share without harm. She says, the lilacs are showing off, or a storm is casing the street like a thief. And once she said, your sister laughed so loudly today, I had to put my hands on the table to keep from laughing too. But she does not say your name, and when I say mine, she shooshes me as if I had spit on the floor. I tried to imagine my mother sitting on the edge of the narrow bed, speaking to Edda as if light could survive between them and not be hurt. The image made my heart feel too large for my chest. I nodded instead of telling her what I could not make sense. Why can't you come out? I asked once, whispering because the clock had just clicked its secret tongue and the house felt newly alert. Why can't you sit at our table and complain about the soup? I could teach you to tie your shoes in the way Father taught me, with the loop that pretends it wants to run away. She smiled at the thought and shook her head. Because someone lost a word, she said, and once a word goes missing, it is hard to find the mouth it belonged in. They named me wrong, or they didn't name me at all in the right books, and then the books started to believe their own thin pages. She looked at the little stop clock. They said it would be easier, she added very softly. They said no one would ask questions if there was no one to see. They said, love and shame wear the same shoes. I don't think that is true, Liesel. Shame clatters. Love went barefoot so it wouldn't wake you. I grew taller. I learned to iron. I learned where my father kept the money in a jar, whose label read oats, and felt the weight of coins like the weight of days. I learned which neighbors to wave to, and which to pass with my eyes on the cobbles. I learned the names of herbs and the names of the saints. The latter whispered to me by my mother in the same tone she used for recipes, as if both were necessary to keep a household whole. I learned the names not given, the names of lost children who passed through town with their families at harvest time, the names of women who came to the church with their coats turned wrong side out, the names of men who left before dawn. And in that learning, I held a private language with my sister that needed no saints to bless it and no herbs to embolden it. We had our clock, our mirror, our key. Once, when I was 16, I stayed too long. We had been laughing quiet laughter, but the kind that travels through bone. About the time the cat slipped into the room and then could not remember how to leave, and how we had to lure it back with milk trails and soft insults. We were still tasting that laughter when the handle of the main hall door, the one with a handle, turned. Footsteps. My mother's, I thought. And then I recognized the vinegar rose cadence of a woman I disliked without having to be taught how. Etta went very still. I stepped into the shadow near the mirror inside the false room. The woman with the red scarf, exactly as Etta had said. The scarf, like a warning stripe on a snake, came into our hallway, and her eyes went to the clock, then to the blank cream door. She set down a basket. She looked at her nails. She listened to the silence with the arrogance of a person who thinks silence is a servant. Etta? She called, not loud, in a tone meant to be sweet and missing the mark by half the width of a hair. It's Thursday. Are we behaving? She reached into her basket and took out a spoon, then another, and set them in a line on the runner, as if arranging small soldiers. How many spoonfuls today, How many silences swallowed? She laughed at her own joke, and the laugh, brittle as sugar left too long by the stove, floated toward our hiding. Etta's hand found mine. I did not know when she had learned to reach like that, and I did not know when I had learned to give my hand without thinking, but we had, and that learning felt like a roof in a rainstorm. We breathed together, slow, and the woman tilted her head as if she had heard the sound of 2 lungs and was counting them. Etta, she said again, and then, in the old ugly voice she used when she forgot to pretend she was kind. Etta, don't you make a fool of me. Come out. Etta's fingers tightened. Not today, she whispered, and though my whole body wanted to be brave enough to open the door and say, no more, my courage was schoolchild courage, quick, noisy, and not very useful. We waited. At last the woman, thwarted by a house that refused to speak her language, set down her red scarf, folded it once, very precisely, and then left. We held our breath until the street took her footsteps and made them belong to itself. Then we laughed again, this time not quietly at all, because sometimes laughter must be a small rebellion, a candle placed where someone said candles do not belong. We grew a little older, and the room grew smaller, and the mirror learned our faces as if they were handfuls of water it did not want to spill. The questions grew heavier, too, like winter quilts. Why had our parents done this? What had they been afraid of? Why had the parish woman been invited into our hallway to count spoons of silence? Answers came in crumbs at first. My father's girlhood friend, who drank too much and liked to talk when the world had softened him, once said to me, "Your mother should have been a queen. She has the jaw for it." I held that sentence like a stone. Another time, I overheard two women at the market say, "It's a mercy they only had one, except, of course." And their voices slipped under the cabbage leaves like eels. And then, one night in winter, when the snow on the sill had the consistency of salt, my mother came and sat on the edge of my bed and did not speak for a long time. The clock was in no hurry. The mirror bruised the moonlight kindly. "I wanted to," she said at last. "I wanted to, and got to, and then all the mouths in town opened like drawers, and everyone put in their salt. I could not lick enough tears to wash it away." "You could have told them to shut their drawers," I said. Too sharp for a girl who had not earned the right to be, and my mother flinched, and then pressed her hand to her chest as if she had heard a bell sound exactly where the ache was. "They said the second one was a sign of my sin," she said flatly. "They said she was my husband's, and they said she was not my husband's. And in the end, it didn't matter which one they believed Liesel, because the word they wanted was shame. And they wanted it to have a face that wasn't theirs. I tried to cover her with my coat and call the weather pleasant. I tried to be a door, but I was only a lock. I did not say, 'A lock can protect.' I did not say, 'A lock can also keep love out.' I did not say, 'I have a key.' I held my breath until my ribs hurt, and I imagined the clock turning its face from me, refusing to see how I had lied by omission to my own mother. When she left, she paused by the hallway and looked into the oval mirror, which showed her back as if it were a road. 'That thing,' she said softly, not to me or to anyone, 'has seen too much.' In the spring that followed, when the lilacs did in fact show off, when Etta and I perfected the art of sharing a single apple as if it were a sacrament, when the parish woman stopped coming, and we did not ask why in case the answer pulled a thread we could not resist tugging. Then I learned the truth in a way that changed not only the color of the walls, but the color of my own name. It came in a letter addressed to my father, delivered by a boy with a bicycle too large for him. My father opened it under the clock, as he opened all letters, with the knife he wore on his belt, and he read it without moving a muscle in his face. Then he folded it and put it in his pocket and went outside and sat on the step. I waited for the sound of a chair being mended that I could use as cover. I waited for a whistle, which he used sometimes to call the dog that did not belong to us, but visited. I waited for my mother to say, "What is it then?" She did not. She stood by the sink and wrung out a cloth so hard it squeaked. At last, my father came in, walked past me and the clock and the mirror and the door, and put the letter on the table with a softness that made my skin cold. "From the home," he said. "They want to know if we will send payment next month, or if they may put her name on the list for the train." "The train to where?" I asked without meaning to. "To the place where the shame goes when it is too much work to carry," my mother said quietly, and then she sat down hard on the nearest chair and covered her face, and the sound she made was like a cupboard collapsing. I took the letter when the room was empty, though the paper burned my fingers. It was from a director whose name was a set of square little teeth. It spoke politely about accommodations and improvements and the benefit of fresh air to girls of that disposition. It mentioned budgets. It mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that a new facility had opened far away, where such matters as documentation and signatures could be simplified. The word used for simplified was a word we had last used for the new lid on the coal scuttle. Convenient. I brought the letter into the hidden room with me, and Etta read it in silence, her face learning a new way to be still. When she finished, she folded it exactly as the director had folded it, and then she handed it back, and when I did not take it, she placed it on the table and patted it, the way you pat a baby's back to bring up the air. "So," she said, in a voice that did not belong to a girl or a child, or even a sister, but to someone who had been carrying something heavy for so long that the floor had forgotten to creak under her. The clock wants to move us. The mirror wants us to look away. The key wants to learn a new door. I shook my head hard enough to make the room tilt. No train, I said. No list. The words felt like a broom. We will not send you. We will not let them make you a convenience. That is not a plan, she said gently. That is a promise. It is good to have both. She reached across and touched the hand I had placed on the table without noticing, and her touch was a bell rung once, clear, unafraid. We are not the only ones, she said, and the way she said it told me she had kept from me something I would have to be brave to learn. There is a whole cupboard of us in this town, in these towns, in this country. There is a hall full of doors, and behind each one someone's mirror pretends it does not know a name. I was not as wise as I wanted to be, nor as brave. But I was as stubborn as the clock that had metronomed my childhood, and as loyal as the mirror that had kept, without betraying us, all the faces it had been asked to swallow. I wrote a letter of my own. I wrote it with my head bent so low my hair brushed the paper, with my heart thumping so hard it made the ink skip. I wrote that there had been a mistake, that we had sent payment, that more was coming, that there was no need to put any name on any list. Then I placed the money jar labeled Oats on the table and took from it coins enough to fill my father's empty pockets, and then some, and I took the letter to the post office and watched the clerk stamp it with a sound like a small door closing. It bought us time. Time is sometimes the only weapon a shy girl has, and sometimes it is enough. We used that time to make a new rule. The door would open at night. The key would sleep under my pillow. The mirror, which had never told on us, would be covered with a shawl while we learned how not to be discovered. The clock could not be stilled, but we learned its softest hours and taught our feet to be as careful as its hands. And I will carry on from the very next breath in my next message. Stay close to me. And if you can, subscribe. Leave a small kindness in the comments and tap like, so I know you're there, listening in the quiet. The first night she stepped into my room, the floor held its breath. I had left the door ajar, my candle trembling with a flame too tall for its wick, the shawl over the mirror heavy as secrecy itself. The key turned with the smallest click, and then Etta's shadow crossed the threshold, thin and sure, like a word, whispered but never forgotten. She wore her dress, the pale blue one, but she had loosened the hem so she could walk without stumbling. Her feet made no sound on the boards, though I swore I could hear the whisper of her heartbeat like a moth's wings. She stood in the center of the room and looked at me with eyes I had never seen in daylight, because they were not meant for daylight. They were meant for places where truth is shy. "It smells different here," she said softly, her hands folded before her like she was holding something breakable, like you, like the hours that belong only to you. I wanted to rush to her, to hold her as sisters do in books and fairy tales, but the air between us was still sacred, fragile. So instead I asked, "Is it safe?" My voice cracked, because the house seemed to be listening with both ears. She nodded once. "The clock knows, but the clock owes me. And the mirror," she tilted her head toward the shawl, "is sulking. It doesn't like to be covered, but it won't betray us, not now." And so she stayed, for 1 hour, maybe 2. We whispered about small things, the taste of apples, the way the wind rattled the shutters, the shapes the moon made when the clouds moved fast. It was not much, but it was everything. When she left, slipping back through the false door, the absence she left behind was the shape of my own heart, The nights multiplied. Soon, Eda's steps across the boards were part of my breathing. She learned to braid her hair like mine, though her fingers were clumsier, and laughed when I teased her about it. I showed her the book I had stolen from the cupboard of Father's tools, a collection of riddles, and we spent hours puzzling through them, trying to solve the ones that seemed written by someone who had forgotten kindness. Eda, in turn, taught me songs, little fragments of melodies she swore the mice had hummed to her in their tunnels. They were not songs I had heard in church, nor the lullabies Mother had once sung when she thought no one was listening. They were stranger, older, and they bent inside my bones like roots. But always there was the fear. Fear had its own scent, a mix of damp wood and hot iron, and it clung to us even when we laughed. My father's heavy steps at night could silence us mid-breath. My mother's cough in the kitchen could make us freeze. And above all, the clock marking time we could not own. It never let us forget that ours belonged to someone else. One evening, Father came home later than usual, his coat slick with rain and his face pale as unlit wax. He stood by the hallway mirror for longer than he ever had, his eyes searching its scarred surface as though demanding a confession. Then, without a word, he pressed his hand flat against the painted door, the one with no handle, and stood there. His fingers curled, not into a fist, but into something weaker like a plea. I watched from the corner, my breath trapped, and for a moment I thought he might turn the key, though I never saw it in his possession. But instead, he stepped back, muttered something about unfinished business, and walked away. That night I told Eda, and her face grew taut, her mouth pinched. "He knows," she whispered. "Maybe not the whole truth, but some part of it. The clock told him, or the mirror did." She touched my hand and pressed it to her chest. "Promise me, Liesel, promise me you won't let them send me away. I am not meant for their trains. I am meant to be your echo." I promised, though my voice trembled like a loose window pane. Weeks passed, and the letter from the home was not the last. 2 more came, each sterner than the one before. I intercepted the 3rd, slipped it from Father's jacket before Mother could see. It spoke of obligations unmet, of consequences, of lists that were growing. It named a date in spring, sharp and certain, like a knife point. I did not show it to Eda. I burned it in the stove when no one watched, but the smoke that curled out of the chimney felt like it spelled her name in the sky, and I feared the whole town could read it. Around that time, Mother began to unravel in ways she thought we could not see. She dropped plates, her hands shaking as though from cold, even in warmth. She sat longer at the table after meals, staring at the wood as if it held secrets she was too tired to keep. And sometimes she whispered to herself, 2 daughters, 2 daughters, like a prayer she no longer trusted. Once I found her in the hallway, her hand on the mirror's frame, her forehead pressed to the glass. The scar across the oval split her reflection, and she looked like 2 women trying to become one. When she saw me, she startled, then snapped, "Go to bed, Liesel." But her eyes glistened with something that had no words. Eda, too, began to change. The room behind the hidden door seemed smaller with each visit, as if it were shrinking to push her out. She grew restless, pacing like a bird too long in a cage. "It's not enough anymore," she said. "Your visits are whispers. I want the world. I want to taste the market air, to hear the river at dawn. I want to know if the sky feels different when you walk under it, not just when you dream of it." I tried to soothe her, to tell her patience was our only weapon. But patience is cruel when it is asked of someone who has already waited too long. One night, she did what I had always feared. She opened the door wide, stepped into the hallway, and stood there. The house seemed to shiver. The clock stuttered, then carried on, as if nothing had happened. The mirror reflected her, whole and trembling, and for the first time I saw us together in its face. 2 girls, 2 sisters, standing side by side. It was a dangerous sight, and it was beautiful. We did not hear Mother's steps until it was too late. She rounded the corner, holding a lamp, and the light fell on both of us. The flame quivered, painting our faces gold and shadow. My mother froze. The lamp rattled in her hand. She did not scream. She did not drop it. She only whispered, "God forgive me," and then turned, her skirt sweeping like a tide, and disappeared into the dark. That was the night everything began to unravel faster than we could stitch it back together. Father stopped speaking at meals, chewing each bite as if it were punishment. Mother grew gaunt, her eyes red-rimmed, her voice sharp one moment and gone the next. And Etta, my sister, seemed brighter, bolder, as though being seen, even in shock, had given her form. She no longer feared the hallway. She walked it sometimes when the house was asleep, tracing the wallpaper with her fingertips, humming the mice's songs in a voice too soft for anyone but me to hear. But I knew the storm was gathering. The letters had not stopped. The neighbors' whispers had sharpened. And in the silence of my room, under the shawl, the mirror sometimes showed me things I could not bear. A train smoking in the distance, doors slamming, faces pressed to glass. And still, I could not let her go. Don't forget, as you breathe with me through this, to subscribe, leave your words in the comments, and press like it. Helps me keep unspooling this truth into the quiet. The morning it all came to a head smelled of damp wood and burned bread. I had risen early, before the light, and found my mother sitting at the table with her head in her hands, the clock behind her ticking so loud it seemed to strike through her bones. She did not look at me when I stepped into the room. Her shoulders were hunched like someone who had been listening to bad news all night. On the table lay another letter, the envelope torn open with a violence she usually reserved for kindling. "Go back to bed, Liesel," she whispered, though her voice was cracked, like glass dropped and caught before it shattered. I did not move. My bare feet stuck to the floorboards, and I stared at the black ink crawling across the page. I knew what it said without reading. A date, a place, the kind of words that never leave room for hope. She lifted her head then, her eyes red-rimmed but sharp. "Do you think I don't know?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Do you think I haven't heard you creeping through the hall at night? Do you think I haven't smelled the candle wax when there should be only dark? You think you've been clever, child, but walls speak louder than whispers." I wanted to answer, but no words came. My chest tightened with fear. Not fear for myself, but for Etta. "She is your sister," my mother said, the word falling from her lips like a stone into a deep well. "Your sister, and she is my sin." She covered her face again, and her shoulders shook. They would take her, Liesel. They would take her and make her disappear. And what am I to do then? Let them? Or fight them? And if I fight, will they not take you too? The room seemed to tilt, and for a moment I thought I might faint. My hands clutched the edge of the table until the wood bit my skin. "Then we hide her better," I said, though my voice was thin, a reed in the wind. "We keep her safe. We won't let them send her away." Mother laughed, a broken, bitter sound. "Safe? There's no safe in this world for girls like her, for girls like you. The only safe is silence, and even that cracks if you hold it too long." Behind us, the clock struck 6. Its chime rolled through the kitchen, deep and certain, as if reminding us both that time would not wait for our choices. That night, I told Etta everything. We sat together on the narrow bed in her hidden room, our shoulders pressed close, the candle flickering as though afraid of the dark pressing in. She listened without interrupting, her face calm, her hands folded in her lap. When I finished, she only said, "I knew it was coming. I've always known. The clock tells me more than it tells you." "What do we do?" I whispered. She smiled, a small sad smile that made her look older than either of us should have been. "We run, or we stay. Either way, the mirror will remember us. Either way, we will not be erased." She reached into the box beneath her bed and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. "I've been drawing the road, the way out. If we go at night, the moon will guide us. If we go by day, the market crowd will swallow us whole." Her calm terrified me. I clutched her hand, shaking my head. "They'll find us. They always find what they call shame." "Then let them choke on it," she whispered fiercely. That was when the knock came. 3 sharp raps on the painted door, so sudden the candle guttered. We froze, our eyes wide. Then my father's voice, low and steady. "Liesel, come out." I looked at Etta, and she nodded once. Her grip tightened around mine, her eyes bright with a courage I had never seen before. "Go," she mouthed. "I'll be here." I rose on trembling legs, smoothed my dress, and stepped back into the hallway. My father stood by the mirror, his face pale, his eyes hollow. He did not look at me, only at the scar across the glass. "I know," he said simply. "I've always known." He turned then, his eyes meeting mine for the first time. "And now, so do you." The clock ticked, the mirror breathed, and in that moment I understood. The house had never been mine, nor his, nor my mother's. It belonged to the secret it kept, to the sister they tried to bury in silence. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment if these words reach you, and press like. Every gesture helps me keep telling what was never meant to be told. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, and tap like. If these pages find you, it helps me keep walking them to the end. Tapestry. The corridor was brimming with the same pale light that had once made the air look like steeped tea. The curtains breathed, though the windows were shut. The floorboards remembered where to creak and chose mercy. I carried the key in my palm, warm from my skin, and I could feel the old brass learning me the way a shell learns the sea. Etta walked beside me without touching, as she always did when we were near the house, giving my breath room to steady. We were grown by then, salt in our hair from journeys that had nothing to do with water. Our bodies held the map of our years, my hands nicked from mending, her wrists softened by charcoal and chalk. We had come to look, not to stay. To look is a kind of staying you can pack. The clock stood where it always had, stubborn as a mule that had learned piety. Its face had clouded, its hands were halted at a minute that only we would remember. Noon, or not noon. The mirror opposite, our necessary witness, had been cleaned by hands, not ours. Its scar was paler, a healed wound. When I pulled the shawl from my bag and offered it, the mirror refused my charity, or perhaps it forgave me. It wanted to see. My mother was smaller. The way of flame is smaller when the lamp is turned down, not because it has less to burn, but because it has learned economy. She sat at the table with her back straight and her mouth easy, that mouth that had learned how to outlast scandal without growing cruel. When she saw us, her eyes filled and emptied and filled again. 2 ribbons, she said in a voice that had made peace with its own echo. I should have tied them to the front door. We tied them to each other, Etta answered simply, and my mother nodded, as if at a recipe she planned to make again when winter softened. My father had died the year before, in a chair under the clock that had failed to scold him for once. He left us the letter you already know, and the habit of winding things gently. He left the oats jar with 1 coin and a seed in it, as if to say, make gardens from debts. He left, too, the quiet in this house, a quiet that did not condemn. I stood in it with the key and felt, for the first time, that the door was not an enemy. The door had been asked to serve too many masters. It had done its best. When I turned the key this last time, the lock exhaled the sigh of a horse released from harness. The room behind it was only a room, as we had already discovered in a briefer visit. A narrow bed, a table with a water ring, a cheap tin clock stopped at an hour that had nothing to do with grief, a square of window that welcomed weather as a guest, not a judge. But it was also not only a room. It was the place where the world had asked us to divide and we had refused. I could still smell boiled milk in the wood when the sun touched it. I could still hear paper settling in boxes that no longer contained notes because we had moved the notes out and into living. "I'll take the clock," Etta said, touching the tin face. "If it won't keep time, it can at least learn to keep company." I watched her lift it, and I thought of that first hum I had kept at 9 years old, like a pearl in my throat. It hummed again, or perhaps we made the sound now with our standing. We did not speak much. After enough years, you stop wasting words on the things your eyes can do. I opened the window. The air tasted of coal and elderflower. A tram bell sounded far away, patient as a milk cow. I watched dust revolve, a constellation inside 4 walls, and I remembered every note, every ribbon, every spoon set down without a sound. The key cooled in my hand. I set it on the table, and then, not yet ready to be that brave, I lifted it again and dropped it into my dress pocket, the old seam I had mended so carefully that only my fingers knew where it had been weak. We did the work that had to be done. We folded linen, not because it mattered to linen, but because the folding allowed the house to learn our hands free of emergency. We took the mirror down just for an hour and cleaned behind it the dust that isn't dust, but years. We wound the big clock. It refused to start. We wound it again. It grudged us, 1, 2, and then faithful mule, it walked. My mother stood under it and smiled, like a girl who has decided to forgive a friend for being late. We made soup. We ate standing up. We left bowls by the sink. We found, under the bed, the box labeled April that had somehow never been opened, tied with a knot I knew as well as the looping of my own name. Etta undid it. Inside were 3 notes and a drawing of a house with legs. The first note was the one where she had written the letter of my name, the letter that belongs to a bell. The second was only a list of birds, as if listing them would help them stay. The third said, "I will be where the alder shadows the path." The drawing showed the door open, the legs preparing. We laughed with the kind of laughter you can afford only when you are no longer afraid of what comes through a door. We stayed until evening gave the walls back their breadth. Then we left. Not in a flight, not in a fury, just in the ordinary way people leave a place that has finally learned to let them go, with a last look, with a last straightening of a photograph, with a brief kiss pressed to the wood where hands had once ached. On the stoop, my mother took our faces in her hands like 2 pieces of bread and looked at us as if she could keep us that way forever. "You were never my sin," she said. "You were my bell. The town had wax in its ears." She laughed at herself for the poetry. She had never trusted it. "Go," she added. "Live in such a way that when someone says shame, you hand them a mirror." We walked to the river, We always do after big rooms. The river has a way of measuring us without scales. On the bridge with the missing slat. The slat had been replaced, but our feet still remembered the gap. We leaned on the rail and read the names of our dead on the water in the language we had made for each other. The language of glances, of breath lengths, of taps. We said our father's name. We said the names of women with red scarves turned pink, of men with pens that had bitten tables, of the girls behind doors, of the boys who had passed them soup without telling. We said the names of children we had not had, and the names of those we had welcomed, the apprentices and boarders and nieces who learned to make bread without measuring. We said our own names, both of them, all of them, and let them float. After we left the river that night, years continued as they know how. One small thing next to another, bricks and windows, quilts and recipes. Sundays we filled with the kind of quiet that doesn't pretend. Etta kept the tin clock on a shelf above her desk. It never remembered hours, but it kept secrets faithfully. Its face a coin the light liked to play with at 4 p.m. She taught drawing at a school that forgot to ask for papers it didn't need. She kept a cup of pencils by the door, for children who could not say their names without shaking. Sometimes she came home with the smell of chalk on her skin and looked so tender and fierce that I, who had learned to respect the holiness of her wrist scars, pressed my mouth to her temple and thanked every undone thing that had let this life happen. I kept mending. The city's torn places came to my table coats that had been righteousness and needed to learn mercy, sleeves that had worn thin in places where love had leaned. I wrote my mother once a month letters full of weather and soup, and she wrote back letters full of apologies and jokes she was just learning how to tell. She came in spring one year and stood in our tiny kitchen like a tall candle and pronounced the kettle satisfactory. Then she stayed to braid onion tops and teach a child who wasn't ours how to peel potatoes with a knife, dull enough to be safe and sharp enough to be respected. We saw the red scarf woman once. We did not plan it. The city brought us to market at the same hour and put us into the same aisle with too much cabbage. The scarf was not red anymore. It had learned the humility of rose hips. She walked with a care that said knees. She held onto a basket that said fewer houses to visit. She caught sight of us only when we were very near, and for 1 second her mouth opened on the scream the scarf had always promised. Then, because she was still a person, she breathed, and because we were no longer the girls who flinched, we stood. Etta reached into her pocket and took out a clean handkerchief with the letter of her name stitched in the stubborn hand she had refined into art. She placed it in the woman's basket without touching her hand. The woman made a sound that wasn't words, neither plea nor defense. She nodded once as if at a church you do not enter, but which holds you anyway. We moved on. There was no triumph in it. That is not what mercy tastes like. There was only the sound of the clock in our skulls softening, a felted tick. Time did what it does. It wore us into our shapes. There were sicknesses and recoveries. There was a winter that closed its teeth on our street and required the neighborhood to become a single animal. There was a summer in which we took the train. Not that train, another, and went to the sea because my mother had wanted to, and we owed her that much at least. We stood at the edge of water that cannot be contained, and let the salt make maps on our calves. We brought back shells the color of unlit candles and placed them on the mantel around the tin clock like a crown. There was also the year my mother died, a good ending as far as endings go, in a bed she wasn't punished by, with my hand on her forehead and Etta's voice reading the names of clouds as if they were saints. After, we went back to the house, not to take, not to judge, just to sit. We left the key on the kitchen table under the shawl, with a note tied to its bow that said, for the door that remembers how to open. The new family who lived there later wrote us kindly, inquisitively, to ask if we had meant to leave a trinket. We told them it was a story they could keep or return to the river. They kept it. Sometimes the world surprises you to the kind side. If you're still walking this road with me, breathe, and if you can, subscribe, leave a gentle word below, and tap like it lets me know your footsteps are alongside mine. You will want to know about endings. People do. We learn to speak them without closing the mouth of the story. Edda grew old the way trees do, ring by ring, hiding lines of storm and spring behind bark that was never ashamed to peel. She taught until her handwriting grew stranger, and her eyes preferred the largeness of faces to the smallness of letters. When she finally let the school give her a party she did not attend, she brought home a bouquet of pencils tied with twine and set them in a jar beside the tin clock. For the next hands, she said, always for the next hands. She asked, near the end, to go once more to the river, and then to the alder path, and then to the green cottage. We went in that order, because order is how some griefs consent to be carried. At the bridge we stood, and said names again, slower now. Not because there were fewer, but because each carried more. At the alder path we pressed our palms to the bark and listened to the sap working like a secret that heals. At the green cottage we found the same door, the same smell of soap that knows water is a blessing, not punishment, and the same woman, no, not the same, her daughter, with her mother's eyes and a voice that had learned to identify fear and invite it to sit until it was ready to leave. She made us tea. We used no names. There are kinds of love that do not improve for being labeled. The night Edda's breath went from being a bell to being a memory of a bell, she lay in her bed, our bed for those hours, with the window cracked to let the world prove it was still there. The tin clock did not tick. It had never lied to us. The big clock in the hall did its faithful chewing. The mirror across from the bed showed her profile as if it were learning a new saint. She pressed the back of my hand to her cheek and smiled the way she had the first night she stepped into my room and called it mine. "We named each other," she said. "That is the only name I ever needed." I told her the mice were singing. She laughed at me for my sentiment. I told her the alder path would still be there tomorrow. She told me not to romanticize trees. I told her she was my first sound. She told me I was her favorite echo. Then she slept, and then the sleeping ran a thin thread into the other thing that looks like sleep and isn't. If you have been in the room when that happens, you know the air afterwards has a new weight, like flour. You will wipe your hands instinctively, as if you've been baking a bread you cannot share yet. You will stand. You will straighten the sheet. You will wind a clock. I do not make a shrine of grief. I put the tin clock on the mantel and fed it light. I hung the mirror where it could see the door and the window at once, like an old woman who wants to keep an eye on both weather and guests. I wore the key on a thread around my neck until the brass learned the salt of me and dyed my skin. I told the children who gathered at my table, not ours by blood, not always by law, but ours by the stubbornness of survival, the stories that are not for frightening, but for unhiding. I showed them how to set a cup down so it makes no sound. I taught them to listen for the extra tick that means someone needs you to go to the door. I taught them to be greedy for the right words. When they asked where I had learned these things, I tapped once, twice, 3 times on the table, and if they were ready, I said, "From a woman with a bell in her chest." Now the house we keep is smaller, on purpose, easier to clean, quicker to forgive. The clock is not as old, but it remembers to be kind. The mirror carries only one scar and declines to collect more. When I cannot sleep, I walk the corridor that exists in every house if you look for it, the one made of night and habit. I run my hand along the skirting board, and I feel, not mice this time, but footsteps of children, the ones coming up after us, the ones who will need a place to sit that is not a cupboard. I check the door, whatever door we have. I make sure it has a handle on both sides. Sometimes I dream the old room, not from the beginning, but from the middle, where the breath lives. In the dream, the key is still smaller than my thumb, and the clock still remembers to forgive. The mirror has stopped swallowing faces. It has learned to sing them back. Edda is there, of course. She looks at me with eyes that belong to places where truth is not shy. We do not speak. We have spoken enough. We sit. We let the dust write a liturgy of light. And when I wake, the morning smells like damp wood and coffee and burnt bread, the ordinary sacraments. I rise. I wind the clock. I set the cup for whoever is coming. If you've come this far with me, thank you. If this story held a key for you, even a small brass tear that warms to the hand, subscribe, leave a word, and tap like not for me alone, but for every door that is learning at last how to open.